Ben Shapiro thought he could control the narrative, just like he always does on his show. He interrupted Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani 9 times in just under 3 minutes, cutting him off each time he tried to speak. But what happened on Mamdani's 10th attempt to finish a sentence left Shapiro completely speechless and exposed him as the ideological bully he truly is. The studio lights were glaring as Shapiro leaned forward in his chair, that trademark smirk stretched across his face. He had invited Mamdani onto the Ben Shapiro show expecting another easy target to steamroll. After all, Mamdani was just a young democratic socialist from Queens. And Shapiro? He was the intellectual warrior of the right, the master debater. What could possibly go wrong? But Mamdani sat across from him, his Nehru collar jacket pressed, his posture calm, and his gaze sharp as a blade. He had done his homework. He knew exactly who Ben Shapiro was, and he was more than ready for his tactics. Before we dive into this stunning exchange, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. You won't want to miss what comes next, because this is about to become legendary. The tension in the room was already thick when Mamdani began his first sentence. He barely got 3 words out before Shapiro pounced with his first interruption. "But Assemblyman," Shapiro cut in, mid-thought. It was classic Shapiro. His signature debate style honed over hundreds of confrontations with left-leaning guests. But this time was different. This time, he'd picked the wrong opponent. To understand why this clash became so explosive, you need to know who these two men are and why this particular battle mattered so much. At 40, Ben Shapiro had built his career on rapid-fire rebuttals, rhetorical traps, and relentless interruptions. He rose to fame as a young conservative firebrand, out-debating college students and liberal pundits alike. Over time, he refined what media critics call the machine gun technique. Overwhelm your guest with speed, volume, and constant derailment. He would prep for hours studying progressive policy language and identifying exact trigger phrases, terms like systemic injustice, settler colonialism, or federal housing justice, that he could exploit to steer the conversation back into his preferred framework. Behind the scenes, Shapiro was known for his obsessive preparation. He would binge-watch old interviews of upcoming guests, dissecting every pause, every stumble, every contradiction. His research team maintained thick dossiers on each progressive figure, complete with out-of-context quotes, controversial tweets, and perceived ideological weaknesses. His show had become essential viewing for millions of conservative followers who relished seeing him verbally dismantle the left. The formula was simple: invite a leftist guest, ask them a provocative question, interrupt them before they can answer, then mock their reaction for the audience. It was political theater with a scalpel, and Ben Shapiro was its undisputed surgeon. He had a particular habit of targeting voices that challenged establishment power, from progressive women to Muslim Americans to young activists of color, because he knew it would resonate with his base. And now, sitting across from him, was a target who checked every one of those boxes. But Zohran Mamdani was no ordinary guest, and what was about to happen would change everything. Progressive legislators, especially from marginalized backgrounds, had long learned to avoid Ben Shapiro's show entirely. They knew it was a trap, a setup designed to embarrass and discredit them under the guise of debate. But Zohran Mamdani was different. At just 32 years old, Mamdani embodied everything Shapiro typically tried to dismantle. He was a Muslim, a democratic socialist, the child of immigrants, and a rising star in New York politics who had already gained national attention for his unapologetic positions on housing justice, police reform, and Palestine. But unlike many politicians who crumbled under media pressure, Mamdani had been refining his rhetorical skills for years. Born in Kampala and raised in Queens, he was no stranger to tension. Before running for office, he had organized tenants, rallied workers, and debated policy with establishment Democrats. He was an organizer first, not a career politician. And perhaps most importantly, he wasn't afraid of confrontation. He had faced it in streets, in union halls, and on the assembly floor. To Mamdani, Ben Shapiro was just another ideological opponent dressed in a suit. What made Mamdani uniquely dangerous in this environment was not just his passion, but his preparation. He didn't just show up to interviews hoping to hold his ground. He studied his opponents like a chess master. He watched hours of Shapiro's past interviews, dissecting his favorite deflection tactics, interruption triggers, and rhetorical traps. Mamdani arrived with a game plan and receipts. "Assemblyman Mamdani," Shapiro began, his tone sugary but sharp, "you've been advocating for this absurd rent cancellation bill that would fundamentally punish landlords and destabilize our economy. Why do you think private property rights should be abolished in America?" It was a loaded question, as always. The word absurd was Shapiro's opening jab, deliberately crafted to provoke. And punish landlords was intended to frame Mamdani's bill as a reckless, radical assault on personal freedom. In typical Shapiro fashion, the question wasn't meant to be answered. It was a setup, but Mamdani had seen it coming. He calmly took a breath and started his response. "Ben, that's a gross mischaracterization of the bill. What we're actually trying to... But Assemblyman, it would eliminate the right of landlords to collect rent in any emergency context. You can't deny that," Shapiro cut in sharply. Mamdani paused, his jaw tightening for just a moment, but he stayed composed. Behind the camera, Shapiro's producers gave a thumbs up. The timing had been perfect. Right at the moment Mamdani tried to reframe the debate, they shut the door. It was the Daily Wire playbook in action. Control the conversation, corner the guest, then spin their hesitation as weakness. "If you'd let me finish," Mamdani said, steady but firm, "I was about to explain that the legislation actually protects tenants and small landlords by... How does banning rent collection protect landlords? That doesn't make sense to normal Americans." The pattern was clear. Shapiro wasn't engaging in debate. He was executing a narrative strategy built on interruption, distortion, and dominance. His research team had flagged terms like tenant protections, economic justice, and federal housing standards as cues for disruption. The moment Mamdani used any of those, the interruptions would come, pre-scripted and timed for maximum derailment. But Mamdani had done this before. He'd faced landlords screaming at him in tenant union meetings. He'd watched budget committee members weaponize similar tactics. His training told him, when the space gets hostile, front-load your sharpest points. So he pivoted. The bill creates a federal housing standard that guarantees every working-class family a safe place to live. "Federal standard?" Shapiro jumped in. "So now you want DC bureaucrats deciding who can own property in Des Moines?" Shapiro leaned forward for emphasis, delivering one of his audience's favorite tropes. The big government overreach angle. It was crafted to spark rage among viewers who feared any form of centralized power. Mamdani's eyes narrowed, but his tone remained measured. "Ben, if you keep interrupting me, your viewers will never hear the facts." That was the first pivot, and it worked. For a moment, Shapiro hesitated. Most guests either got flustered or grew defensive under pressure. Mamdani? He had just turned the spotlight away from himself and onto Shapiro's own tactics. And it was only just beginning. "So you want unelected Washington bureaucrats controlling local rent control laws now?" Shapiro leaned forward as he launched the interruption, his signature move designed to project aggression and dominance. His audience lived for moments like these, rapid, pointed, confrontational. It gave them the feeling that their champion was standing up to government overreach and defending individual liberty. The phrase Washington bureaucrats had been focus group tested to ignite conservative outrage. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was a weapon. But Mamdani didn't flinch. "Ben," he said, eyes steady, "if you keep interrupting me, your viewers won't actually get to hear the facts about this policy." That was his first direct challenge to Shapiro's tactics, and it threw Ben slightly off rhythm. Most guests either wilted under the barrage or got defensive, giving Shapiro the upper hand. But Mamdani was doing something different. He wasn't taking the bait. He was naming the game and still playing it with calm precision. Shapiro leaned back in his chair, the smirk on his face growing just a little wider. He thought he had this under control. "I'm just asking the tough questions," he deflected. "The ones the mainstream media won't dare ask, Assemblyman." It was a standard line, one his producers had drilled into him for moments exactly like this. It framed him as a lone truth teller, while implying that Mamdani only thrived in safe spaces. Usually that tactic worked. It reset the dynamic and pushed the guests back onto their heels. But not this time. Then let me answer them, Mamdani shot back, his voice a touch sharper now. The federal guidelines would actually protect both renters and small landlords. They'd prevent the kind of mass evictions we saw during COVID. And evictions? Shapiro interrupted again. Come on, Assemblyman. Landlords need to be paid too. You're making this sound like oppression when it's just economic reality. The interruptions were speeding up now, and Shapiro was clearly enjoying the show. In the control room, producers were probably thrilled. Viewers were tuning in by the thousands to watch yet another progressive get steamrolled on live conservative media. Engagement metrics were likely spiking. Clicks, comments, shares. The machine was humming. But something was changing. Mamdani's posture shifted. He was no longer leaning forward, trying to get a word in. He sat back, composed. The carefully diplomatic organizer was fading. In his place was something more formidable. The relentless strategist who had helped organize tenant unions in Queens. The calm firebrand who had debated establishment Democrats under far worse pressure. 4 interruptions deep, his patience had narrowed, but his strategy had sharpened. Because Mamdani understood something Shapiro didn't. Sometimes you let your opponent hang themselves with their own arrogance, and then you pull the rope. Ben, Mamdani said evenly, in New York alone, we saw over 92,000 eviction filings in a single year, primarily in communities of color. Entire neighborhoods lost their housing stability because of predatory landlords backed by toothless policy. Shapiro scoffed. Those are just Democratic talking points. Assemblyman, can you cite actual evidence? Or are you just playing the class warfare card again? Most Americans don't buy into these conspiracy theories about systemic oppression. Isn't this really about socialists wanting to stay in power by giving away free rent? It was his 9th interruption, but he didn't notice the shift in Mamdani's expression, the subtle narrowing of the eyes, the slight tilt of the head, the posture of a man no longer defending his point, but preparing his strike. Because at that point, Shapiro wasn't debating anymore. He was overperforming, consumed by the rhythm of his own performance. He didn't see what everyone else could feel through the screen. Zohran Mamdani wasn't trying to get his message across anymore. He had become something far more dangerous. A prosecutor who had just watched the defendant impeach himself 9 times in a row, and the 10th was coming. The audience at home could feel it too. Social media was already on fire. People were counting the interruptions, documenting Shapiro's blatant bias, and waiting for the moment Zohran Mamdani would push back. The hashtag #LetHimSpeak had started trending, with viewers voicing their growing frustration over the obvious imbalance. Mamdani leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile forming at the corners of his mouth. He had let Ben talk himself into a corner. And now it was time to pull the rope tight. His instincts, not just political but prosecutorial, told him the jury, the American public watching in real time, was ready. Ready for the closing argument they didn't know they were waiting for. What happened next would be clipped, shared, subtitled, and replayed millions of times across every platform, quickly becoming one of the most devastating live takedowns in online political media history. Mamdani turned directly to the camera, ignoring his Shapiro completely for a moment, and addressed the audience. You know what, Ben? I want to thank you. Shapiro blinked, caught off guard. This wasn't in the prep notes. Guests were supposed to implode, not thank him. They were supposed to get flustered or flail defensively, not seize control of the studio. His production team froze. His producer started frantically flipping through backup questions in the control room in case things veered further off script. Thank me? Shapiro asked, almost laughing. Yes, Mamdani said, his voice now carrying the quiet force of someone who had just taken command. You just gave the perfect example of what I mean when I talk about conversational suppression. You didn't need to say anything explicit. You just interrupted me 9 times and prevented me from sharing even a single full idea with your audience. Shapiro instinctively began to interject again, but Mamdani raised his hand, calm, measured, authoritative. It was the kind of gesture a judge makes when restoring order in a courtroom. And unbelievably, Ben Shapiro stopped talking. for the first time in the entire interview. "For the last 3 minutes," Mamdani continued, "you've interrupted me 9 times. You've used your platform, your microphone, your control over this space, not to debate but to silence me. And then you question why communities like mine talk about being shut out of national conversations. This," he said, his eyes steady, "is what suppression looks like." The studio fell completely silent. Even the camera operator seemed unsure whether to cut to Shapiro's stunned expression or stay locked on Mamdani's powerful gaze. The control room stopped speaking into anyone's earpiece because no one knew what to do. Shapiro's trademark smirk had vanished. In its place, genuine confusion, vulnerability. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd walked straight into a trap of his own making, and there was no way out. But Mamdani wasn't done. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Every city council fight, every tenants' rights hearing, every attempt to silence his voice in mainstream media, it had all been training for this exact confrontation. "You see, Ben," he said, "what you just did to me is exactly what powerful institutions do to marginalized people every single day. They interrupt, they speak over us, they control the terms, and then they act shocked when we call it suppression. They make sure the only voices heard are the ones already in power." His voice gained momentum. Each word landed with surgical precision. And at that moment, the millions watching knew this was no longer an interview. This was a reckoning. The camera had zoomed in on Mamdani's face, capturing the quiet intensity in his eyes, the calm fire in his expression, and the slight smile that said, "I'm not finished. I'm just getting started." This wasn't the flustered socialist Shapiro had expected to corner. This was a master communicator who had just turned Shapiro's own studio into his classroom. Mamdani leaned forward. His voice now carried not just conviction, but command. "You interrupted me when I brought up the 92,000 eviction filings in New York. You cut me off when I mentioned federal tenant protections. You silenced me when I tried to cite actual cases of housing discrimination. Just like policymakers are silencing working-class renters by gutting housing budgets, cutting tenant rights, and stacking the system against anyone without property." The parallel was devastating in its simplicity and in its accuracy. Shapiro's behavior had just become the perfect metaphor for everything Mamdani had come on the show to explain. Ben had, on live camera, recreated the exact suppression tactics he claimed were exaggerated or non-existent. He didn't just prove Mamdani's argument, he became the argument. Shapiro finally found his voice, but it came out weaker now, brittle and defensive in a way his loyal audience wasn't used to. "Now wait a minute, Assemblyman." "No, Ben," Mamdani cut in with surgical calm. "You've had your turn. You've interrupted me 9 times. Now it's my turn to speak." The role reversal was stunning and absolute. Ben Shapiro, who had built a career dominating guests through interruption and rhetorical aggression, was now the one being cut off. And he didn't know how to handle it. His whole persona, the smirk, the speed, the smug leaning forward, collapsed. All of it was gone. In its place, silence. "You invited me onto this show to discuss housing policy," Mamdani continued, his voice clear and unwavering. "But instead of engaging with facts, you turned this into a performance, designed to humiliate and silence me. And in doing so, Ben, you made my case better than any speech or statistic ever could." He turned to the camera again, calm, focused, precise. "This," he said, "is what suppression looks like. It's not always loud, it's not always violent. Sometimes it's just interrupting someone 9 times before they can finish a sentence. Sometimes it's deciding who gets to be heard and who gets dismissed." Shapiro was visibly unraveling now. His earpiece likely blared with panicked producers trying to redirect him, but he looked frozen. No guest had ever done this to him. Not like this, not flipping the script so completely. "And here's the irony, Ben," Mamdani added, his tone shifting to almost conversational. "You talk a lot about intellectual honesty, about integrity in debate, about freedom of speech, but you can't even maintain the integrity of a 10-minute interview. You can't even let a guest finish one full thought, let alone a policy proposal." The devastation was complete. Ben Shapiro hadn't just been out-argued. He had been exposed, not just as a bully, but as a hypocrite. He silenced Mamdani's voice while claiming to care about open discourse. He blocked facts while posing as a guardian of truth. And now millions of people were watching it unfold in real time. Social media exploded. Clips of Mamdani's takedown were being shared thousands of times per minute. Hashtag let him speak, Mamdani, meltdown, or silence. No more. All of them were trending worldwide. Shapiro made one last attempt to salvage the interview. "Assemblyman, I think you're being a little overly dramatic." "Dramatic?" Mamdani raised an eyebrow, calm but razor sharp. "Ben, I'm a housing organizer who became an assemblyman to fight for working-class families. You're a millionaire media personality who built his career by interrupting people for clicks. So tell me, which one of us is being dramatic here?" That was the final blow. The interview was over. Shapiro knew it, his producers knew it, and everyone watching knew it. He had been completely outmaneuvered by someone he had written off as an easy mark. And the aftermath? It was unlike anything conservative media had seen in years. Within minutes of the segment ending, social media was flooded with clips, reactions, and stunned commentary. What viewers were already calling one of the most devastating takedowns in political podcast history was going viral at record speed. Twitter erupted first. The hashtag #LetHimSpeak soared past 500,000 tweets within the first hour. Users posted side-by-side comparisons of Shapiro interrupting past guests, proving Mamdani's analysis wasn't about one moment. It was about a pattern of silencing dissent that had gone unchecked for years. A former Daily Wire producer posted a tweet that went instantly viral. "I worked with Ben for 3 years. I've never seen him look that rattled." Mamdani didn't just win, he exposed the whole tactic. It's not debate, it's scripted domination. And it finally backfired. Instagram and TikTok exploded with fast-cut clips of Mamdani's key lines, especially the moment he told Shapiro, "You can't even maintain the integrity of a 10-minute interview." Young activists turned the 9 interruptions into memes, infographics, and sound bites. What had started as an attempted ambush turned into a masterclass in media literacy. But the clip that got shared the most? Mamdani looking directly into the lens and saying, "This is what suppression looks like, folks." It hit a nerve, not just politically, but personally, for anyone who had ever been talked over, dismissed, or told they didn't belong in the conversation. Behind the scenes, the Daily Wire was in damage control mode. The company had built its brand on owning the libs. But Mamdani had just flipped the entire formula, making Shapiro look petty, unprepared, and weak. Leaked emails would later reveal that several advertisers contacted the network with concerns about being associated with the clip. And Shapiro? Shaken. His usual post-interview routine, cherry-picked clips, smug one-liners, and victory lap tweets, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his Twitter account went dark for more than hours. Speculation spread. Was he being reprimanded internally, or did he simply not know how to respond? When he finally did post, it was a flat attempt at spin. Great conversation with Assemblyman Mamdani tonight. Always good to have hard debates on important issues. But the replies were brutal. Even longtime fans were questioning what had just happened. "Ben, she ran circles around you. You couldn't finish a sentence, man. This ain't it." On Capitol Hill, support for Mamdani poured in, and not just from the usual corners. Progressive lawmakers tweeted out clips with praise. Zohran just gave a masterclass in how to handle media manipulation. Calm, clear, unflinching. But the shock came from across the aisle. Several Republican lawmakers, speaking anonymously, told reporters, "I don't agree with a damn thing Mamdani stands for." But that was impressive. He completely outclassed Ben. The interview quickly became mandatory viewing in political science and communications classes across the country. Professors used it as a prime example to teach media bias, the critical importance of preparation, and the intricate ways power dynamics operate in broadcast journalism. At Georgetown University's School of Public Policy, the segment was incorporated into the core curriculum. Professor Sarah Chen remarked, "This single exchange teaches students more about media manipulation and political communication than entire semesters of theory. At Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, a special seminar was created. The Mamdani Method, a course focused on turning hostile media encounters into educational opportunities. The seminar became so popular that enrollment had to be capped, with waiting lists stretching into the hundreds. Students didn't just analyze what Mamdani said, they studied how he said it. His timing, body language, strategic pauses, and his remarkable ability to reframe the entire conversation under pressure. Law schools also adopted the interview as a teaching tool in their trial advocacy programs, showing how Mamdani's courtroom skills translated seamlessly into the media arena. Students learned how to spot when opponents were undermining their own credibility and how to seize those moments for maximum impact. Meanwhile, other networks seized the opportunity to take shots at Daily Wire and Ben Shapiro. CNN's Anderson Cooper opened his show the very next night, saying, when you invite someone 9 times and interrupt them 9 times, don't be surprised when they use their 10th chance to school you on live television. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow devoted an entire segment to breaking down the interview. She highlighted how Mamdani had used Shapiro's own behavior to illustrate broader points about suppression and silencing tactics, turning a hostile interview into a powerful metaphor for systemic oppression. Maddow called it brilliant political communication. Even conservative media figures struggled to defend Shapiro's approach. Talk radio host Hugh Hewitt, usually a staunch Daily Wire ally, remarked on his show, "Ben made us all look bad. You can't claim to champion free speech and then spend 3 minutes preventing someone from speaking." The interview marked a clear turning point in Shapiro's career. While he remained on air, his approach noticeably changed. He became far more cautious about interrupting guests, especially women and people of color. Aware that social media was now actively monitoring for patterns of suppression and bias, his ratings suffered significantly in the weeks following the interview. Internal Daily Wire data showed Shapiro's show lost nearly 200,000 viewers in the crucial 25-54 demographic within a month of the Mamdani interview. More critically, potential guests began declining invitations to appear on his show. Many cited the interview as proof that the show was no longer interested in good faith discussions, that it had become a rigged game. This created a serious booking crisis for Shapiro's producers, who struggled to find credible Democratic figures willing to face what was now widely seen as a hostile trap. For Zohran Mamdani, the interview was a career-defining moment. Requests for speaking engagements poured in from across the country. Democratic organizations eagerly sought him out to represent their causes on stages large and small. Zohran Mamdani's fundraising exploded overnight. Small-dollar donations flooded in from supporters inspired by his calm and unwavering stand against Shapiro's barrage. In the 48 hours following the interview, Mamdani raised over $2.3 million, more than his entire previous quarter combined. Media training organizations quickly began using clips of Mamdani's performance to teach other politicians how to handle hostile interviews. His technique of turning an interviewer's aggressive tactics into a teachable moment became known as the Mamdani Method among progressive communication strategists. Beyond politics, the interview sparked nationwide conversations about interruption, respect, and power dynamics, not just in media, but also in workplaces and personal relationships. The hashtag #LetHimSpeak evolved into a broader movement, encouraging people to call out silencing tactics in their own lives. Women's advocacy groups embraced Mamdani as a symbol of how to respond to dismissive and interruptive behavior, turning his calm yet firm response into a blueprint for confronting workplace bullies and dismissive colleagues. The interview also reignited discussions about media literacy and the importance of recognizing bias and manipulation in news coverage. Educators now use the Mamdani-Shapiro exchange to teach students how to identify loaded questions, interruption tactics, and other forms of media manipulation. Perhaps most importantly, Mamdani's brilliant connection between Shapiro's interruption tactics and systemic housing injustices gave progressive movements a powerful new metaphor. Activists began using the concept of conversational suppression to explain how marginalized voices are silenced in media and politics. The interview clips became powerful tools for education, helping people understand how suppression works, not just through obvious methods like eviction or policy barriers, but also through subtle methods of silencing and dismissing voices that challenge the status quo. Community organizers reported that sharing Mamdani's clips helped residents grasp the broader patterns of suppression they faced in their own lives. Civil rights organizations embraced the metaphor immediately. The NAACP tweeted, "When Zohran Mamdani showed how media suppression mirrors systemic oppression, he gave us a teaching tool that will educate Americans for years to come." The clip became required viewing at community workshops, voter registration drives, and civic engagement events nationwide. The Mamdani-Shapiro interview set a new standard for how political figures should handle hostile media appearances. Instead of just surviving the experience, Mamdani showed that prepared, principled politicians could turn the tables on biased hosts and use their platforms to educate and empower the public. Other progressive politicians began studying his approach, sparking a new generation of media-savvy leaders unwilling to be steamrolled by conservative hosts. This shift forced outlets like the Daily Wire to reconsider their interview tactics. Knowing guests were now prepared to fight back effectively and armed with social media amplification and real-time fact-checking, media training programs across Washington incorporated the Mamdani defense into their curricula. His approach became a case study in political communication programs at universities nationwide. The interview also demonstrated the power of social media to amplify moments of authentic resistance and truth-telling. Mamdani's success proved that in the age of viral content, a single powerful moment could reach millions and shift entire narratives. Months later, the Mamdani-Shapiro interview remains a watershed moment in American political media. It showed the era of unchallenged media bullying is ending, and that prepared, principled politicians can transform hostile interviews into powerful teaching moments. For Ben Shapiro, it was a humbling reminder that treating guests with respect isn't just good manners, it's good television on. His attempt to dominate and humiliate Mamdani spectacularly backfired, making him look petty and unprofessional while elevating Mamdani into a national star. For Zohran Mamdani, it launched him into the top tier of progressive political figures and established him as someone who can stand up to any challenge. He proved you don't need to shout or fight dirty to win. Sometimes you just need to be smart, prepared, and patient enough to let your opponent defeat themselves. The interview became a perfect case study in how power dynamics can shift in an instant when someone refuses to accept the role they've been assigned. Shapiro had cast Mamdani as a victim, but Mamdani rewrote the script, turning Shapiro into an unwitting demonstration of everything wrong with modern political media. This incredible showdown between Zohran Mamdani and Ben Shapiro shows us something powerful. When we are prepared, principled, and patient, we can turn any challenge into an opportunity to educate and inspire others. If this story fired you up like it did millions of others, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss moments like these. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite part of how Assemblyman Mamdani handled the situation? And what other political showdowns would you like us to break down? Remember, in a world where bullies think they can silence important voices, sometimes the most powerful response is to stay calm, stay smart, and let them prove your point for you. Zohran Mamdani didn't just win an argument. He gave us all a masterclass in how to stand up to power with grace and intelligence. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see what real strength looks like. Because when we support voices like Assemblyman Mamdani's, we're supporting democracy itself. See you in the next breakdown, where we'll dive into another moment when truth conquered bullying on live television.